Proverbs 28, verse 9. If one turns away his ear from hearing the law, even his prayer is an abomination. Not something you hear quoted in many churches today, yet it's in the book of Proverbs. What about Proverbs 28, verse 18, which says, "When there is no prophetic vision, the people cast off restraint. But blessed is he who keeps the law." Proverbs 28, verse 4, "Those who forsake the law praise the wicked, but those who keep the law strive against them." Proverbs 28, verse 7, "The one who keeps the law is a son with understanding." Proverbs 10, verse 8, "The wise of heart will receive commandments, but a babbling fool will come to ruin." Proverbs 6, verses 21 and 22 echoes Deuteronomy 6, verses 6 to 9. Proverbs 6, verse 23 also echoes Psalm 119, 105. Isaiah 51, verse 7 states, "Listen to me, you who know righteousness, the people in whose heart is my law." Isaiah 51, verse 7 just gave us the definition of righteousness and how to practice it. Psalm 119, verse 174, David calls the law his delight, and he was called a man after God's own heart. So it would make sense that we also need to delight in God's law if we are to be called a people after God's own heart. Psalm 119, verses 151 to 152 tells us that all of God's commandments are true and that he has founded them forever. Psalm 119, verse 172 tells us that all of the commandments are right. So it makes sense to say that in order to practice righteousness, we need to keep God's commands. Psalm 119, verse 144 even tells us that God's testimonies are righteous forever. Verse 137, David says, "Righteous are you, O Lord, and right are your rules." How do we practice righteousness? By keeping the law of God, keeping his rules and commands and delighting in them. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. 1 John 5, verse 3. We do not keep the law to be saved, we keep it because we are already saved. Just look up Luke 1, verse 6. Zechariah and Elizabeth walked blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. Psalm 119 speaks highly of God's law. Jesus says that he is the Alpha and the Omega, or in Hebrew, the Aleph and the Tav, which is the first and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Something to note of interest is that Psalm 119 is the only chapter in the Bible that separates its sections by the Hebrew alphabet, beginning with Aleph and ending the chapter with Tav. Do you think he's trying to tell us something? If we want to know the Aleph and the Tav, maybe we should pay attention to Psalm 119. In Malachi 4, verses 4 and 5, God himself tells us to remember the law of his servant Moses. How long? Until the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Some people interpret this as being Jesus' first coming, but it is clearly referencing the second coming. But people take it to mean the first coming because when speaking of John the Baptist, Jesus does say, "And if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come." Matthew 11, verse 14. But Jesus also said, "For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John." Matthew 11, verse 13, just one verse prior. Is this then to say that all the prophecies from the Old Testament have been fulfilled? Not at all. Many prophecies still have yet to be fulfilled, some of which will not happen until Jesus comes back. Micah chapter 4, verses 1 to 4, "The mountain of the house of the Lord is in fact the temple." The temple still needs to become the most important place on earth, according to that passage, and it will not happen until the millennial reign, when Jesus is reigning. As verse 3 clearly states, "He shall judge between many peoples, and shall decide for strong nations far away." Clearly this is a prophecy still yet to be fulfilled, along with Zechariah 14, verses 9 to 21, which clearly is speaking of the second coming. And notice how Jesus enforces the Feast of Tabernacles on the whole earth, and according to verse 21, sacrifices will again be taking place in the temple. According to this passage, the millennial reign is going to be much different than how people imagine it. If Jesus is going to be enforcing Torah in the millennial reign, does he not also want us to keep it now? Matthew 5 verses 19 to 20 tells us that if we relax even one commandment from the law and teach likewise, we will be called least in the kingdom, but those who keep them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Clearly, Jesus does want us to keep God's law as it was given to Moses, and clearly all the prophecies from the prophets have not been fulfilled as some believe. Jesus did say that John was Elijah that Malachi speaks of, but is this to say that the great and dreadful day of the Lord has already come and gone? Surely not. But some prophecies can have multiple fulfillments, as we see in John 19, verses 36 and 37. The prophecy that says, "They will look on him whom they have pierced," was fulfilled at the cross. But we know this prophecy is also speaking of Jesus' second coming as well. Just like, yes, John the Baptist was called the fulfillment of Malachi's prophecy of Elijah, but many, myself included, believe this is also speaking of the end times. Many believe that the two witnesses in Revelation will be Enoch and Elijah, since neither of them saw death before being taken to heaven. We know that the great and dreadful day of the Lord happens at the second coming, but it may also have had a multiple fulfillment at the cross. In conclusion, yes, Jesus does still want us to keep the law of God as given to Moses, and there is much biblical evidence for this. Through my videos, I am trying to give you guys as much of that evidence as I can find. I'll end with Isaiah 42, verse 21. "The Lord was pleased for his righteousness' sake to magnify his law and make it glorious." The root word for Torah is Owr, O-W-R, or R, A-U-R in Aramaic, which means light. For the commandment is a lamp, and the Torah a light, and reproofs of instruction are the way of life. Proverbs 6, verse 23. Also see Isaiah 8, verse 20. "To the Torah and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them."